We should be recording again. I think so. Let me just make sure. It says what? Sounds like we're recording. All right. Angela says we're recording, so we must be. So yesterday I had the great and extreme pleasure of sitting through a California Association of Realtors Forms Advisory Forum. Doesn't that sound just exciting? I'm on their list so I can, complain about forms and ask for revisions. Mostly I just listen. And so what they talked about was a variety of the forms that have been changed and why and what the focus is. I've summarized some of that information in the handout, which looks like this. And this is referring to the C.A.R. RPA, and in the other versions of the RPA, like the RIPA, etc., a lot of the same changes have been implemented. So some of it is simply layout. And by the way, at the end of this document, and you have a PDF, which it's the same thing, I have a copy of the December revisions in the RPA, which means that it has, here, let me do this. I'll show you what I gave you. So, oops, how about this? This is what it should look like, right, from your end. Some of it is a just reorganizing the layout and grouping legal clauses together. The rejection box has been moved because, first of all, a lot of people never fill them out, but that's when you make an offer and they say, no way. There's a box they're supposed to check that says that they rejected it. They do that so you, as the buyer's agent, have some hope that that means that they actually presented your offer. There have been changes in occupancy and possession, particularly the vacant possession default, which in the past you could say, well, it's going to be vacant or it's not going to be vacant at close of escrow. The default is vacant. If it's not going to be vacant, then you would use the TOPA, which is the tenant occupancy purchase addendum. They've added in a little bit more information where you should clarify who's there and what the roles are. And we're going to actually go through the form in just a minute. Some seller disclosure requirements, the RAD form, and I actually put together, with the help of some friends, some how to fill out some of the new revised forms and things like that. And there's a checklist because some of the issues that are causing the most problems has to do with vacant possession and the disclosures. And so you have all that. Then this is a copy of the RPA, which the areas are marked in red so that you can see which ones have been revised. Excuse me for a moment. All right. Smooth. Right. So let's just go through the process, right? Your in-zip forms. And by the way, one of the topics that was discussed is third-party use of C.A.R. forms. What they really were talking about is SkySlope. Now, if you're at EXP uses SkySlopes, many Keller Williams, and there are a lot of offices that use SkySlope. And SkySlope does have a set of forms. But what is true is that a lot of times the forms on SkySlope are not the most recent versions. And in fact, at EXP, if you talk to the brokers, which I have, they'll tell you don't use SkySlope to write your forms, just use the C.A.R. because they're more up to date. And I'm assuming that if something comes up that's important, then I'll get to it later if it's in the chat, right? So you've logged into Zip Forms. Is that showing my screen? Should be. And just so in case you haven't done this very often, you go to new purchase or offer. And then we're just going to do a demo. I used to actually prepare mock offers on actual properties. The YouTube didn't like that because I'm giving out personal information. The name of the transaction, if it's a purchase, would be the address of the property. Um, now that could be, you would put the same thing in the street address. I'm not going to go through all of this. You would select residential. Now, two of the things that and this is difficult to do without a real property, but when you put in the address, you'll notice a button that says MLS Connect. And then there's a button once you put in the address of the property here. Here, I'll do a real one, but all right. Now that should make things come alive. So if the property is in the multiple listing service, and that means your multiple listing service. So I'm in MLS listings, but let's say the property is in San Jose, but it was listed in Bay East or San Francisco or Barris or Metrolist or C.A.R. MLS. It's not going to import very well because it's not in my MLS. However, you also, and by the way, both of them would be something to look at, you would use Record Connect. And what Record Connect does is it looks up public record information and it'll import information and it gives you the choice if it's a trust of because a lot of times it's in the wrong order, the name and all that. It'll give you a chance to fix all that. The MLS Connect will bring in most of the information from the seller side. In that, I mean the listing agent, the listing broker, whatever. It oftentimes does not bring in the listing office DRE number, which you're going to have to add. You ought to have templates and I have a bunch of them for the different areas. And what the template would have is you would complete your information, your DRE number, your broker's information, their address, their DRE number, and you'd get all that done in advance. So that if you apply the template and you import information from MLS Connect and or the Record Connect, then you've filled out most of the data that you're going to put into the contract. Now, the other thing you just want to make sure that you've done prior to doing this is that you want the buyer's information in zip forms as a contact so that you don't have to type all that out again. And by the way, zip forms will look at your Google and or other, places where you have your contacts, and it'll allow you to import the information. So you have the parties already in it. You have the office and your office, your name, the listing agent's office and name, and you're all ready to go. And then it doesn't take very long to write an offer. All right. So, which I just like to cover this because a lot of times I know they can't find the property address. It's a commercial one, but that's all. So now that we're here, and you'll notice at the top, MLS Connect and Record Connect are what you would use to pull in some of that information. We're going to go to Add Doc, Add Form, and the second form. And the reason that it's the second form is that if you're writing an offer, you better have a buyer representation and broker compensation agreement, right? For members of my team, when we get to the section how to write an offer, that's the first thing. Do you have a BRBC already filled out? If the answer is no, do that first. Because the California Civil Code says you have to have it before you write an offer. The settlement with the NAR and the MLS said before you show the property. If you're on my team, talk to me if that's what's going on. And so we're assuming you've already got that. Now, usually the BRBC is in a different folder because when we create a zip forms folder for the BRBC, that's usually the name of the buyer. when we are writing offers, we would be using the street address of the property. And that's because sometimes we have to write more than one offer in order to get one accepted. That's just the way it is. So I'm just saying. All right. So now that we've opened it up, and I'm going to go through, an example, and then I'll talk about some of the things that have changed. The first thing you want to look at is how many buyers do you have? Now, I haven't put in the buyer's information, but I'm doing it now. And I would click, if there's one buyer, put in the name. If there's two buyers, you click. You need to click the boxes, right? And it's put in my information because I've imported it. The second page of agency disclosure is a copy of the civil code. I tell people that they could read it if they have insomnia some night, but it just says in the code we have to give you a copy. There it is. And now we're to the beast itself, right? Now, date prepared is the date that you're preparing the contract. It is not the date that the offer is made. Could be, but doesn't have to be. It is not the date that the offer is signed. Could be, but I mean, by that I mean accepted and signed. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. It's simply the date that you're preparing it. Is it important? Well, yeah, because all the other forms, counteroffers and contingency removals and all those other forms that are going to refer to the residential purchase agreement dated, and that's the date that they're going to be referring to. So it also has a place where you can put in an assessor's parcel number or numbers. Now, I've sold property. There was a property we sold in Cupertino where the guy had a great big lot and a great big house in the middle of the lot. But what he had done, this was back before Apple and all that, he had bought two lots next to each other and then built one house in the middle. Now, the address was just the one house, but it was really two legal lots, right? It really was. And so you understand we might have more than one assessor's parcel number if there's been, a merger of the different lots, you would put it in there. So if we use the MLS Connect, it should have the name of the brokers, right? And you'd click that, and you'd have the name of the listing agent, and you want to make sure you have their license numbers. Particularly if you're at EXP and you don't have it, they'll be telling you go get it. And so and where would you get that from? Well, it's in the MLS. Why doesn't it import it with MLS Connect? MLS Connect almost always imports the listing agent's information, but not the listing office DRE number. It just doesn't ever seem to do that. But you want to make sure when your broker is reviewing it, they're going to be looking to see that that information was all completed. I'm not going to do that. If there's more than one brokerage, then there's an additional broker acknowledgement. Have you ever partnered with another agent? Now, EXP allows you to partner, co-list, and co-sell with agents that are not part of EXP. You can do that, right? Not all brokers let you do that, but basically EXP's position is if the DRE says you can, then why should they complain, right? So if you've got that kind of an arrangement, you're supposed to note it here and fill out another form, which we're not going to get into. So purchase price, what did I do? All right, $1 million. So in Silicon Valley, that's like a condo next to the sound wall. But, now, if you're checking the box all cash, good news, maybe bad news. And the reason is one of the upgrades, one of the revisions that they did with the forms, and they started this actually back last July, is that there's a law that says if the buyer is an entity, LLC, corporation, for example, and they are not getting a conventional loan, which means all cash or a hard money loan, then there's this federal reporting requirement because they're maybe thinking these are drug dealers or terrorists and they're buying real estate with all the cash that they have in the duffel bag or whatever, right? And so it's good in one sense that you have an all cash buyer, but you need to know that that triggers this additional form, which we're going to see is a box you could check. I'm not going to go through the form right now, but in the past, real estate agents have basically said, well, all of that stuff about the all cash buyer being reported to the federal government, that's something that the, escrow company is going to do. Or I don't really need to worry about that. Well, the law now is clear that as a real estate agent, you have an obligation to notify your clients as well as escrow that that's what's going on. And so there's a form for it, which we're not going to talk about. Close of escrow, what do most agents do? Well, they'll check the box and put in 30 days. Now, you might want to think about that because my thought is that we want to write an offer that we're not going to have to change. So what is the day that 30 days is from today? What is it? Now, if it turns out to be a weekend or a legal holiday, we know it isn't going to close that day because closing under the RPA means recording. That's what it means. There's a definition section. And you can't record on weekends or legal holidays because, well, the county recorder's office isn't open, right? So you can't record. The other thing that I don't like is if it falls on a Friday, because I made a video at one point called something to the effect, they don't always close on time, right? They don't always close on time. And so one of the examples, I had a team member who was buying a house for himself, and he was an engineer, right? So he had like a Gantt chart or what, tracking the transaction. He did not use the lender that I had suggested because why should he? He, knows everything. And he had scheduled it to close on Friday. He had told he was turning off his internet, turning off his power. The movers were coming on Saturday, and it was like Tuesday of that week. And I was talking to him, and I asked, "Have you gotten the CD, the closing disclosure from the lender?" And he said, "Not yet." And I really, not yet. He said, "Well, no." And I said, "You realize you're not going to close on Friday?" Because once the closing disclosure is given to the borrower, they have 3 days to review it. And for the 3 days, Saturday is included, but they're not going to close on Saturday. So generally, you would need all the loan docs in and everything signed on Thursday and the money and everything to be sure you're going to close on Friday. And if they're late, they being the lender with putting the money in, the buyer putting their money in, or the escrow company getting everything together to record, and you miss the recording time, the cutoff, you're not closing that day. So when he figured out that he wasn't going to close on Friday, but the movers are coming on Saturday, all of his utilities are being turned off. He's now begging the listing agent, "Would you let me in? Can I move in early?" And the seller said, "No way, no way." Because I already understand the downside of Friday, right? And even Monday is an issue. Because if you have everything signed and you want a fund to be sure that you're going to close on Monday, that means Friday you would want a fund, and that means you're paying interest over the weekend. And when people figure that out, they don't like it. See, I like Wednesday. right, as a closing day, right? We have a little bit of a buffer, right? We have a couple days, business days before it closes. We have a couple of days after, just in case something goes wrong. I would, instead of doing that, I would pick a date. Does everybody get that? I would pick a date. All right. Offer 3 calendar days after buyer's signature is the default. If you were selling your house, how long would it take you to decide if you liked an offer? Would you need 3 days to decide if $1 million was enough? I bet you could tell in 3 minutes or less, right? You would say no, or that looks good. So if you give them 3 days, this is what I do. If I'm a listing agent, you give me an offer and it's $900,000, and you give me 3 days, I'll say, all right, well, I'm going to present it to my seller. And then another agent calls me and says, you have any offers? I say, yep. How can you give me some idea? I'll say 900,000. And they're like, oh, well, thank you. And then they come in with an offer of 925, and then another agent calls and says, do you have any offer? And I say, yeah, 2. Top one is 925. They, oh, thank you. And now we get an offer for 950. Another agent calls. You see where this is going. And each time I'm going to tell them what the highest offer is so they can beat it, right? So don't give them 3 days. You would want to ask the listing agent, if I got you an offer today, how long would it take for you to present the offer to the seller? Right? 3 hours, maybe, right? Otherwise, it's called shopping your offer. Initial deposit, the law does not require that it be a certain amount. 3% is what we generally use to show, to show that we're motivated, right? Why 3%? Because the liquidated damages in the California Civil Code says that if the buyer is buying a 1 to 4 unit owner occupied property and the buyer defaults, the most that the seller can keep as liquidated damages is 3%. Does it have to be 3%? No. Old school used to be we would offer 1% now and we would raise it to 3% when we remove the contingencies. But in my area, there's hardly any contingencies. That model is still followed in a lot of commercial transactions because until you remove the contingencies, they're not going to get to keep your money anyhow. Right? You could say 7% to show off, but if I'm the listing agent, I know that we can't keep 7%. Right? It may show that you're motivated, but everybody, get that. Then notice it says within 3 business days after acceptance by wire transfer. It does, in the old versions, it used to say check or, I don't know, wire transfer. I mean, it gave you a couple of choices. Now it's simply wire transfer. Now, the 3 business days, I would leave that as a default unless the listing agent was smart and said something in the instructions, which if the listing agent is smart, then they would say, we want it by the next business day. So I had a transaction recently. We were in contract on Thursday. We made an offer. We didn't change this because why would we want to? The listing side, the seller countered, but they did not change this. So Thursday, we're in contract. And at this point, the listing agent figures out that we still have 3 business days. So the listing agent is pushing me saying, can you do it tomorrow, Friday? Please do it tomorrow, Friday. Right? I asked my client if they wanted to do it tomorrow, Friday, and they said no. If we have, how many days do we have? Well, Friday is a business day. Monday is a business day, not Saturday and Sunday. Tuesday is a business day. So we really don't have to put the money until Tuesday if we don't want to. And why would we want to? the listing agent is going nuts, sending me, threatening text messages, refuses to change the status to pending. But you understand that gets you fined by the MLS. So if you're on the listing side, you don't want 3 business days. You would say by the next business day. But if they haven't told you that, then, just let it slide. Increased deposit, we usually don't fill it out. That would be if you put down a small deposit now, and that would still happen in residential if there was a lot of ifs about the condition of the property and, whether or not it's built with permits and all these other issues. And the buyer might say, well, I don't want to give you 3% when there's all these problems with the property. I'll give you 1% now, and I'm going to increase it to 2%. That's the increase by 2%. And there's a form for it. When you check the box, it launches the form, and we usually write in when contingencies are removed. Loan amount, it's important to put it in, but it how important it is would depend on whether or not you have a financing contingency. So if you have a loan contingency, is what I mean, then not only should you be putting in the loan amount, but you also should be putting in an interest rate. And I don't think it lets you put in 0. Because if you don't say an interest rate with points, then you're basically saying if I could qualify for the loan, it doesn't matter that interest rates jumped, I still have to buy the house. And that's not how buyers generally feel. So, but if you don't have a loan contingency, then it doesn't really matter what you put in because that's not a contingency. But if you do have a loan contingency, the details about the loan become important. You do want to say that it's an 80% first. Now, I've actually had some team members, it's confusing and it looks shady. And what I mean by that is, let's say I have a buyer who's going to get a hard money loan or a home equity line against property they already have. They could be putting $200,000 down. They could show they have that money, but they don't want to. And in fact, let's say they're saying that they just don't want to. So that other loan, the HELOC, the hard money loan, that loan doesn't even show up in escrow, right? Because it's not in escrow. It's not what's called a purchase money loan. A purchase money loan is a loan you use to buy property where the property you're buying is security. That's all this is asking about. It's not saying, oh, I got money from another property I own. That's not a purchase money loan. You're using it to purchase, but the security is not what you're buying. So what we sometimes do as a strategy is that if we can show cash sufficient. So let's say this is instead 600,000. That would mean 40,000 down, right? Now that looks stronger, doesn't it? If you were the seller, 60%. But you really don't have, you do have the 400,000, but you have no intention of putting it in. You're only going to put in 10 or 20% of that, and the rest of it is going to come from off the transaction loan. This looks good. Is that illegal or unethical or immoral? I say no, right? Because that other loan is not a purchase money loan, and therefore it doesn't belong here. Right? Because does it matter what this property appraises for if you've got a HELOC on something else? Well, no, doesn't matter, right? Does everybody understand that? Right? Just saying. Maybe I shouldn't have recorded that, but anyhow, if it's FHA or VA, you check the boxes. I'm not going to get into that too much. There are contingencies that are automatic because there's this, addendum that gets included. If you click seller financing, there's a seller financing addendum. Additional, this is it if you're getting a second against that property, right? An 80-10-10 is an example, not as common as it used to be, but it's still out there where you got two loans. But anyhow, that doesn't get checked very much. Notice the occupancy type is defaulted to primary. In the past, you could check boxes. Now you would only check the box if it's not going to be a primary residence. All right. Now we're getting to the good part, paragraph G. There's seller credit to the buyer, and then there's additional seller credit terms. And a lot of agents, and I understand why, get confused as to what's the difference between those two. And the forms people have what I thought a hilarious explanation. But G3, right? 3G3 is where this is the one agents really want to, focus on, which is the seller payment to compensate the buyer's broker. Let's just say it's 2.5%. We generally aren't writing in and or whatever, but it could be a fixed amount. Now, the reason they have 3G1 and 3G2 is they had considered collapsing those two into just one line, but they knew that real estate agents, right? Real estate agents were like cattle, right? I grew up with cattle. It may be obvious. And if you had like a walkway where the cattle walked and you were clearing brush and you piled it up, they would for a long time just walk into the pile. And then they would learn to walk around the pile. And then when you remove the pile, guess what they did? They still walked around that area, even though what was blocking them is no longer there. Now, if you're wondering, what does this have to do with real estate agents? Some people may see the obvious connection, but they knew that if they changed the broker compensation from 3G3, real estate agents wouldn't know what to do, right? They would be confused because they're used to writing that in 3G3. So in order to keep the order intact, they have 3G1, which is a seller credit to the buyer, and a 3G2, which is an additional seller credit to the buyer. What could you put here? Credit towards closing costs, interest rate buy down, anything. Does it really matter where you put them? No. No, right? If you wanted to separate them, or you're wanting to say this amount is for the 2-1 buy down and this amount is towards close, whatever. They all, by the way, are treated the same as a credit towards closing costs. They're all treated the same. But that's why there's two of them. Verification, notice it says that what we call proof of funds is attached. There is no specificity as to what that means. Right? It isn't defined as to what constitutes proof of funds. So if the loan agent writes in the pre-approval letter that we have verified the buyer's assets and they're sufficient to close, that constitutes proof of funds. I've had clients that had so much money in the bank, they did not want to show that to the seller. They didn't want to, right? Because the seller would be hearing, coins dropping, right? When they saw it and figure, well, they can afford more or whatever. So they didn't want to do that. So the loan agent would say, we have verified that they have the funds to close. If you don't have that, you would have bank statements or pictures of the stock portfolio with blacked out. It's a lot easier if the loan agent just does it. Verification of down payment, same thing. That would be in the pre-approval letter. Verification of the loan, that's all done in the pre-approval letter. And if over here you don't want to be pre-qualified, pre-approval is better, and fully underwritten is really what you'd rather be. right? Because it means that, and by the way, if it's fully underwritten, you probably shouldn't have a loan contingency, right? I mean, there's something contradictory in those two. Well, we want a loan contingency, but it's fully underwritten. Well, no, it's not, then, right? So, and there's a relationship between the terms and the price. The more contingencies you can remove, the better price you can get. But just saying. Final verification of condition is what we call a walkthrough. I have agents panicking because they're supposed to do a walkthrough and they went through C.A.R. forms and they can't find the form. I have to explain to them that's because the form is not called a walkthrough. It's called a verification of condition. We call it a walkthrough, but that's not the name of the form. And you get to do that 5 days. That's another one. Assignment request would most likely come up if you're trying to assign the property to an LLC or to a trust, which you can do, but you're supposed to give the seller and the escrow company time. And the reason they put in 17 days as the default is because people were waiting till like 2 days before it closed and then say, hey, I want everything done in the name of an LLC. Contingencies, the default is 17 days. It is generally not, you generally should have a lower number in California. Why is it 17? Well, they were debating in the forms people, should it be 21 or should it be 15? And they couldn't come to a clear resolution, so they cut it in half and they said 17. That's it. So what would you put in if it's not fully underwritten? You would talk to your loan agent. You would call Badal up and say, hey, how many days do we need in order for you to be sure that my clients are actually going to get this loan? And sometimes you might hear, well, I'm already sure that they're going to get this loan. Great. Right? You could make it a short number or remove the contingency. Sometimes it's like, well, we see some issues that we're going to have to research. We need time. Well, then you'd make it longer. Appraisal contingency, do you have enough money that you could afford to buy the property even if it doesn't appraise? I sometimes go through like a stair step. Well, if it came in, it's $1 million is what we're offering. Supposing it came in at 990, that would mean in addition to your down payment and everything else, you have to put in an extra $10,000. Would you do that? Oh, I guess so. All right. How about if it was 980? $20,000. Would you do that? Yeah, I wouldn't like it, but I could. All right. How about 950? Right. And at some point they're going to say, no, 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 that's it. I'm not going to put in an extra 50,000. I'll go for 30 or whatever. Well, that allows us to check this box and say, let's say we've concluded that it's 970 is what this is what is called the appraisal gap. Now, if the price changes because of the counter offers, the appraisal gap amount does not change, right? Because that's what you said you're willing, that's what you can make up, right? Excuse me, I said that wrong. So the appraisal gap is 30,000. I said it backwards. If they counter us at 1,050,000, the appraisal gap still is 30,000. So it would raise that number so that the gap is still 30,000, right? That's the amount that the buyer says they'll put in. Does it take 17 days to get a property appraised? No. Who would know? The loan agent, Badal would know. How long does it take for us to get an appraisal? And he says, I see 12 days often. If you've done your work on the loan, 12 days. Do not change investigation, right? you might change that. Now, why would you? And again, if I'm seeing it's 12, it's oftentimes 12 up and down the line. But investigation, does the seller have a termite of property, a prelim, a TDS and SPQ, HOA documents? So they have all that. Then the question for the buyer is, do you want to get another termite inspection, property inspection, etc.? Now, if I'm representing the buyer, I'm looking at the property inspection and the termite report to see if there's other issues that they've called out that require further inspection, or that it says in the property inspection, you ought to have a plumber look at this or an electrician look at this and that sort of thing. Because rather than getting another property inspection, it would probably be more useful for us to get a contractor bid on how much it would cost to fix the stuff. Because most of the time, the next property inspection says pretty much the same thing as the first property inspection. Right. So, how long that needs to be, let's say the seller doesn't have any of those because they're not in Silicon Valley. Then the question is, how long would it take to get a termite inspection of the property? Right now, not very long, because the overall number of sales is down and the inspectors are generally sitting around looking for business. But you would call and ask, get a couple of them and say, look, we're about to go into contract, we think, in Mountain View, Mountain House, or wherever, someplace with mountain in it. That's what we're planning on. How long would it take for you to do the inspections? And by the way, if you're talking to them on Monday, they usually are going to do it that week. So how long would it take you to get the inspections and read them and think about it? You put in the number. Don't change informational access, right? Just to make everything 12. Don't do that. Now, first of all, this is not a contingency, but let's say we put in 12 days here. What that means is that after 12 days, the buyer does not have a right to come in and look at the property except for the verification of condition. They can't come in and measure things. They can't have a designer come in. They can't have a contractor come in and give a bid, right? Because they've said after 12 days, we're not going to need access to the property anymore. Now, virtually never does a listing agent argue on informational access. Leave it to 17 days, right? Leave it. Right, so that you can come in and do measurements and get bids and do all that other kind of stuff. Insurance, you can call an insurance agent up now, right? And you can say, hey, we're writing an offer and this is the property address, and I'm just wondering if there's any insurance issues. Huh? And usually the insurance agent can tell you over the phone whether or not there's going to be any issues with that particular address. If there are, you want to make sure you have an insurance commitment. But what I find is that it's easy if we have everything lining up, right? So it makes it cleaner. It doesn't have to be this way. That removing all the contingencies on the same day, right? It's just less work. Listing agents I prefer that too. Review of sellers' documents. That's the TDS, the SPQ, all that sort of stuff. Usually we're putting in the same day. The preliminary title report, common interest disclosures means HOA documents. And that's after acceptance or 5 days after delivery, right? Notice that difference. Review of leased or liened items. I might leave that at 17. I've done a class recently on all the issues that can come up with solar panels. If they don't have solar panels, this could be nothing, right? But you could say, I like to keep everything the same. Sale of buyer's property, we're going to do a session on that in a few weeks. We're not going to talk about it here. If it's possible to click on that box, that would make your offer stronger. Don't remove the appraisal contingency unless your client really understands what that means. And if you check this box, it pulls up the contingency removal form, which has a whole bunch of things that you could remove. Right? If they don't have inspections, don't remove contingencies. Right? Time of possession, notice it says upon recordation. Well, it used to say 6 o'clock on the day of closing or something like that. Now it says when it records. And if it's recorded at 2 o'clock, you can move in at 2 o'clock. Seller occupied or vacant units. Close of escrow is the default. If there's anybody other than the seller in the property, they're called a tenant. Tenants aren't necessarily people that pay rent. The word tenancy comes from the Latin word tenare, which means to hold on to, like tenacious people don't let go. Tenured teachers can't be fired, right? Tenancy, and it's not just renter, joint tenants and tenants in common are not renters, but we still call them tenants. So what that point is there's any adult living in the property who is not the sellers, a nephew, friend, whether they're paying rent or not, they're tenants. Do they have tenant rights under the law? The answer is yes. Yeah, they do. And so if there's anyone there other than the seller living, you're going to want the tenant occupied property addendum. And its default setting, which we're not going to do today, but its default setting is that the property has to be vacant by the time escrow closes, subject to tenant's rights. Yeah. Delivery of documents, I usually don't change this. 75373, whatever. Right? We just don't bother messing with that. This requires a 3P, requires that you pay attention to the property when you go look at it. Yeah. Do they have a stove, a refrigerator, a washer and dryer? Now, dishwashers, microwaves, that's not, that's, if they're built in, there's another clause in the contract that says they're included. But let's say they're just sitting on the counter. Right? A microwave, let's say there's some dishwashers, this isn't very common anymore, but you can hook it up to your faucet and it's like a standalone thing that's off to the side. That's what they're talking about, right? Not a built-in microwave or a built-in dishwasher, right? That's already included, right? But you want to read the MLS and you want to make sure that what's there, right? Because I've actually had agents tell me that they weren't sure if there was a washer or a dryer. They didn't pay attention, right? When they were looking at the property, they don't remember. So go look on the MLS and look at the pictures and see if there's a picture of a washer and a dryer. Video doorbell, security camera equipment, security alarms, smart control. You check the boxes, right? Check the boxes. Electric car staging, charging. Potted trees and shrubs. You see, that's a difficult thing. If the tree is in the ground, well, then, yeah, it belongs with the property. But let's say it's in a great big planter. Well, if you don't check the box, it's not included because it's not growing in the ground. Excluded items or additional items, if it says in the listing agreement that the seller wants to take the Tiffany chandelier, you could mark the box and say excluded is the Tiffany chandelier. I don't know if people still have it. And the NHD, do they already have one? Right? If it were my listing, there would be one. If there's no natural hazard disclosure, then you can ask for one, which, by the way, the seller is required to make those disclosures. Typically, we have the seller pay for it. We check environmental, and you can pick the one you like. I tend to use disclosure source. Now, if they say, well, we've already picked one, you just need to know that the NHD companies don't charge unless it closes with them being the NHD. So if the seller has picked property ID and you like disclosure source better, there's reasons why you might. They're not going to charge the seller twice, right? They're not going to pay for a property ID and a disclosure source. Only one charge is going to go through, right? If you don't want to fight with them about it, you could pick whichever one they've picked or type in seller gets to choose, right? Which is something we sometimes do, right? Optional wildfire disclosure report. You would want to know whether or not NHD says it's in a very high fire zone. And I'm going to be doing another class. I've got videos on this later that we've done in the past that go into this. I'm not going to go into this in great detail. Q3, generally you don't do anything with that. Smoke alarms, CO2 would be, the seller. Government required point of sale and corrective remedial actions. Now, as a buyer, we would rather the seller pay for any of that, and sometimes lenders want to not see this as a buyer expense because what are we talking about? Now, if you're wondering, what are we talking about? A point of sale inspection. So in some areas, there's sewer lateral rules. Morgan Hill has one. If you're going to sell a single family home, you have to have a sewer lateral inspection. You have to. And somebody has to be obligated, the seller or the buyer, to fix things that are wrong within a certain time period. Has to. If you're in Santa Cruz County, the water conserving plumbing fixtures, they're going to send somebody to look at the house. They're going to look at the toilet and the showers and the faucets. And if they're not low flow, that's going to have to be fixed or they won't let you sell the house. In LA, they have rules about minimum insulation because that affects air conditioning and other things like that. Now, I've created a prompt, which our transaction coordinator has, which is asking for, if you put in an address of the property into the prompt and you go to Gemini, and it's a really long prompt, and it pulls up all the local area disclosures that would be affected by that particular address. Look at it. By the way, escrow companies know what they are too. And if it's within your MLS, like Bay East and some of the others, they actually have a list, right, of local area disclosures where they might talk about that. But sometimes the seller doesn't like it because they don't know what we're talking about either. Escrow, how do we know who pays what? Well, you would look at a website, right? And I use ChicagoTitleTransferTax.com. That's literally the URL. And even the different AI programs, because this is all public information, but listing agents don't like it if it's a buyer pay county and you ask for the seller to pay. They don't like it, right? And this is not the best way to begin. So what you would want to do is to find out, is there a city transfer tax? How much is it? Who customarily pays it? Is it the buyer? Is it the seller? Is it split? And whatever that is, you would put it in. So for example, Santa Clara County is a seller pay county. Alameda County is a buyer pay county. If there are some counties where it's split, and anyhow, but if the listing agent has already opened escrow with a particular title company, I would tend to just go with that. Now, in the rule is essentially, part of it is a written rule, some of it is an unwritten rule that whoever pays gets to pick. So if you're in Alameda County and the buyer is paying escrow and title, then the buyer might say, well, I want to pick. Usually it's the buyer's agent because the buyers don't care. And if it's title, the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act says that if the buyer pays even a penny of the title insurance premium, the buyer gets to pick the title insurance company. They could waive that, but you can't force them to use, So I generally try not to fight over this, but find out what's customary, ask the internet, and have this follow. If they've already picked one, put that in. If you just don't want to argue, you would type in something like seller can choose. Right? Don't put in seller's choice. There was actually some escrow company in Southern California that changed their name to seller's choice. That's what they changed their name to, because real estate agents were always typing in seller's choice, seller's choice, seller's choice. And that's us. Anyhow, the buyer pays for the lender. County transfer taxes are paid by the seller. City transfer taxes. Don't just pick seller. Spend a moment to look up and see, does that city have a city transfer tax? Because it's irritating to listing agents if you're asking the seller to pay a fee that does not exist. Right? It shows, well, sloppiness, right? So you'd want to check that. HOA transfer fees are typically paid by the seller. Private transfer fees, rarely do we see these. Sometimes in a subdivision, there's something that says every time the property is conveyed in the future, some money has to go to a library or something like that. But that would be in the prelim. Usually this doesn't exist. If you have an inspection contingency, you could discuss it later. Anyhow, blank places. Home warranty, if there's not multiple offers, it looks like a normal sale, we would ask the seller, we would put in a dollar amount. How would we come up with the dollar amount? Well, you would again use this thing called the internet. Like I use Fidelity National Home Warranty. If you typed in Fidelity National Home Warranty brochure, you would find many copies of a PDF of their brochure. You can look, given whether or not there's a air conditioning system and other things, it would tell you what it would cost for what level of coverage. Right. So that's how we would best come up with the number. Issued by, you could just uh, let's see, which one is here? Fidelity National. The buyer can waive it. That means they're not asking the seller to pay. And over here, if there is something special you want covered, you can put it in. Uh, and notice it says here, home warranty plan chosen by includes but is not limited to, and you could write in some of the special things. Look at the brochure. Other terms, if you're writing stuff here and you're on my team, show it to me first. Because a lot of time I see poetry. I actually had an agent once that literally rhymed things here. Like poetry, right? Just because he was bored, I don't know, right? But generally, we don't need to write in a lot of stuff. What I find annoying is when agents want to write in things that are already in the contract, like, purchases to be as is. It already says that. Yeah, just, don't say it twice. So now this is the grid, which is we pretty much come to the end of what you can fill out. There's some addendum that you could, check. We're not going to go through all of that today. There's a bunch of advisories. You could include the wildfire one, the trust advisory if the seller's a trust or the buyer's a trust, the statewide buyer and seller advisory. Why isn't that a hardwired thing? Because many of the listing agents already have that form filled out, right? And there's really not a lot to fill out. It's just address and things like that. But you would want that in the package. But since it's there oftentimes already, you would have to check it to add it. And then here is a line by line additional information description of what all those different parts of the grid refer to. Now, I have done this type of a class where I went through the whole thing, every paragraph. But I realized that that was kind of wasting everybody's time because it seemed like nobody could remember. I mean, if you're not doing this often, you're not going to remember. And I also reflected on the fact that in all these decades of me doing this, the number of clients that have asked to hear an explanation of every paragraph is a really small percentage, right? Virtually nobody cares. So why bother? And I had one of my team members, this is in Silicon Valley, the buyers both had PhDs in technical areas, both of them. And they sat up one night and went through the RPA, the NHD, all of the disclosures, all of them. And they took screenshots and pasted them in a document, a Google document, and wrote in questions. And by the time they were done, there were 90 pages, right? Yes, and I know that most of them have a cheat sheet. The cheat sheet, Colleen, is a PDF. I just use the website, which I could look up on my phone as
Yeah,
well.
they gave me a printout and it just makes it really easy depending on which
Yeah,
county you're working
right.
in.
I know, but I don't print stuff.
No, not for you. I just meant for your
Yeah,
audience.
yeah, that's true. They all have that. And by the way, Gemini and ChatGPT know that those things are on the internet too, right? If you
Great point. Thanks, Michael.
if you just said Sonoma County, who pays what in a real estate transaction, it would spit it out because it has access to all of them as well. I just like the website. It's I can do it on my phone and scroll down and see. But then I'm dealing with more counties at one time, maybe.
No, your AI point is excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. See, first I used to hate paper. Now I'm not that happy about PDFs, right? Because I have to put them someplace and then I have to go find them again. Yeah, if it's on the internet, I just want to do that. All right. Any questions? The only part I didn't go through is that if they're an entity buyer, how to fill that out. So anyhow, back to the 90 pages. By the way, my agent who saw the 90 pages of questions kind of freaked out, right? And forwarded it to me with, what am I supposed to do? And I said, make an appointment because I looked at them and none of them were very hard, right? It's just it basically hit everything. And because I'm doing this like all the time, it's a lot easier for me to explain those clauses, right? Than if you're on my team, I would just say, let's talk to the guy and ask him, you know, to say, right? But it doesn't happen very often. Any questions?
Yes, Michael. Q4 and Q5, do we really need to fill that out?
You're referring to the
Government retrofit and inspection.
not necessarily.
Yes, but you fill it up though in your forms. That's why I'm I'm
Well, so
asking.
first of all, ask the loan agent whether or not the lender is going to care. Some do,
Okay.
right?
So the lender.
So there's two things. First of all, is there a government required retrofit?
Okay.
Is there a sewer lateral rule? Is there, I mean, there's a whole bunch of them. And if the answer is yes, that there's a sewer lateral, requirement that they have an inspection and that it gets fixed, shouldn't you be discussing in the contract who's going to fix it? If it's a requirement. Now, Santa Clara County doesn't have any of those. There's no, I mean, San Jose doesn't have any of those. Like Morgan Hill has sewer lateral, but so if you're in San Jose, there isn't any, right? So leave it blank. But that's why I premised it by saying, why don't you find out if there's a sewer lateral or a government retrofit requirement?
Okay, thank you.
But what would you say? Do lenders, because I've had some lenders not like it when it said buyer pays because they now want to know pay what.
I think we go by county city requirements. So if if it's required by counties, then yeah, we require to.
You want to know who's going to pay
Yeah,
for it. Yeah.
yeah,
Because let's say the buyer is like, I've seen some sewer laterals that were $9, $10, $12,000. That would be of interest to the loan lender,
yeah,
right? That there's another $9,000 debt that the buyer is starting with, right? You need to, in advance, I wrote a prompt that you can use in Gemini or ChatGPT. If you're on my team, you get our transaction coordinator has it, right? And so she takes the address and sticks it into the prompt and pastes it in, and it generally uncovers all that stuff. All right, fun.
Michael, I have a
Thank you.
question. I'd like your clarity on the G, G1, 2 and 3, or well, 2 and 3. I heard you say, and if I'm incorrect, please tell me, that on G1, when you were going back and saying, the credit for the seller to credit to buyer, I thought I heard you say that it could be, how could I say? It could be the commission where the seller is paying, but it specifically says it can't be for
Right.
G1, that it has to just be a credit for anything other, right?
Right. What I said was that they decided, they being the people who put together the forms, that we really don't need both of them. Right. We don't need G1 and G2. And they had considered taking out G2 because they basically are saying the same thing and they're treated the same by the lender. It's the same thing. But they chose not to do that because that would mean that the commission is no longer 3G3. And remember my cow story, right? The wandering cows, right? That they were afraid that real estate agents would be confused because what happened to 3G3? It's gone. Oh my gosh, it's gone. I'm not going to get paid anything. So they decided to leave 3G2 there just to keep the place of 3G3. But is there any meaningful difference between 3G1 and 3G2? The answer is no. Now, if you wanted to, you could say, well, one of them is for an interest rate buy down and the other one is for credits to closing costs. But the lender is going to treat them all as a credit to the buyers for closing. I mean, it's all the same thing, right? But if you felt like breaking it into parts for whatever reason, then you could do that. But it doesn't really matter. There is no substantive difference between 3G1 and 3G2. They are asking the same question.
Thank you. I was making notes and that's where I think I lost it. So 3G, G1 and G2, you're saying are the same?
Yeah,
And G3 is for compensation.
that's right.
Thank you.
And there is no good reason to have both of them, but remember the cows, right? That's what they think of us.
Michael, this is Tricia Maganini. I have a question about electronic delivery address.
Say that again. Electronic delivery.
Electronic delivery address.
Right. So that's typically the listing agent's email address.
Yeah, I'm just confused by the way the form is written now because we enter our contact info, license number, email, and our phone numbers. And I just want to clarify that the phone number, if somebody should choose to send me a PDF on a text or something, but not my email, that's not considered delivery, correct?
No, well, let me pull up the form. All right.
I'm not sure if this section changed from the past, but it used to make me think that I didn't enter my phone number here. So when I was writing an offer for a buyer, I purposely did not include my phone number.
Yeah. So I don't think the phone number, let me find it.
It's agent signatures and delivery. It's down below.
All right. So it's not phone number, but email. And they used to have a form called DNA, which is the delivery notice address or something like that. And they've gotten rid of that. And this was a change they made a little while ago. And so this is the issue, right? Let's say the buyer's not removing their contingencies and you want to send them a 2-day notice to perform. Well, that's 2 days from when? Well, 2 days from when it's delivered. Now, I've actually in the past had real estate agents who stopped answering their email, stopped answering their cell phone because they didn't want to be given the notice because then they'd have to do something. And in fact, this was an extreme case. We actually hired a process server to wait outside this agent's house to get him when he was coming in and hand him the notice. So what they decided to do is that's, not to play those games, but and the difference is now is that when you say this is, and it's usually the agent's email, this is the address used for delivery of notices, then it's not when they've received it that's important, but it's when it was sent. And if you want to get into this, it's the difference. There's a difference between delivery and receipt. If you think about boxers, right, there's a difference between delivering punches and receiving them. There's a difference. So it's now considered that we don't care whether you opened your email or not. Right? We don't care, right? Because you could just choose not to do it. But once we've sent it to your email address, the one you put here, it's now been delivered for purposes of the contract. If it's in your inbox, you've got it, it's delivered. I know you probably are shocked to hear that real estate agents would refuse to open their email just so they couldn't be given a notice. Shock. All right, but that's what this is about. So if you put the email address above the one here, that's the default one. And more than one, so designated electronic delivery address, email above, that's referring to the buyer's agent's email. Or you could have a separate one. And there's an alternative delivery methods, which nobody ever checks. But you can read the form if you feel like it. But that's what that's about.
So the way it's written, somebody couldn't argue that the phone number above.
It says email address.
Yeah, so that specifies
It's
email.
not, it has nothing, it's not the phone number.
Okay.
It's the email address. All right. Are we good?
Excellent, Michael, thank you.
All
Oh,
right.
good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, bye,
Thank you.
everybody.